Hello everybody. Dear Laura, dear Christine Windbichler and Gavin Baltes, dear colleagues, dear guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 17th Paul B. Baltes Lecture and to introduce today's eminent speaker, the Fele Dickinson Professor in Public Policy, the Professor of Psychology at Stanford University, and the founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity, Dr. Laura Carstensen. Dr. Carstensen received her PhD in psychology at West Virginia University. After an assistant professorship at Indiana University and a visiting professorship at the Institute of Human Development at UC Berkeley, she moved to Stanford University in 1987, where she was promoted to associate in 1994 and to full professor in 1998. Her research on theoretical and empirical aspects of motivational, cognitive, and emotional aspects of human lifespan development has been funded continuously by the National Institute on Aging for more than 30 years. The Stanford Center on Longevity, which she founded in 2006, is the first of its kind and unique in its mission and vision. It seeks, and I quote from the center website, to accelerate and implement scientific discoveries, technological advances, behavioral practices, and social norms so that century-long lives are healthy and rewarding. The focus of the center is on the need to reconsider and restructure the entire lifespan when aiming for better and longer lives. The center has a fellowship program called the New Map of Life. It includes young scientists from many different disciplines, ranging from economics to biology and psychology, who interact with their faculty advisor at the center to elaborate new approaches to the life course. It is worth noting that our own doctoral program, the International Max Planck Research School on the Life course, which will actually hold its fall academy here in Berlin in a few days from now, is built on the same premise. And we are proud to say that one of the Life alumni, Neelam Ram, is now a professor at Stanford and a co-director at Laura's center. Laura Carstensen is a fellow of many professional associations and learned societies and has served as a member and chair of numerous research committees and grant review panels. For instance, she was the chair of the Behavioral and Social Sciences section of the Gerontological Society of America, and she chaired 2 studies for the National Academy of Sciences, resulting in 2 influential reports. She also, I would like to add, was an esteemed member of the advisory board of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development and served as its chair from 2003 to 2005. Laura has a long list of honors. Let me mention some of the earliest and some of the most recent ones. Back in 1985, she received the National Institute of Health New Investigator Award. In 1993, she received the Richard Kalish Innovative Publication Award from the Gerontological Society of America. In 2003, she was appointed Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2005, she received the Merit Award of the National Institute of Aging. To move to more recent times, she received both the Kleemeyer Award and the Distinguished Mentor Award from the Gerontological Society of America in 2014. In 2016, she received her second Merit Award from the National Institute on Aging and was elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. In 2023, she was elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This year, she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Rochester, where she completed her Bachelor of Science, the second after her honorary doctorate from the University of Leuven in Belgium, which she had received in 2012. Laura Carstensen's research interests include emotional development across the lifespan, the role of social relationships in psychological well-being, and the influence of motivation on cognitive processing in old age. In the mid-1990s, Laura Carstensen proposed a new psychological theory of the development of motivation and emotion across the life course, termed Social Emotional Selectivity Theory, or SST. This theory is generally acclaimed as the most productive and progressive research program on the development of emotion and motivation across the lifespan, and I'm sure we will hear more about it today. With her work and her vision, and I may add her breathtaking energy and charisma, Laura Carstensen continues to shape research on behavioral aging in the United States and worldwide. And you don't have to search far to appreciate her leading role. Just take a recent issue of Der Spiegel. You may remember it. How Will We All Get 100 Years Old was the title of the Spiegel on the cover of the issue, so it was a cover story. In the final paragraphs of the cover story, the journalist gave the floor to Laura and her positive vision of a longer, more individualized and more fulfilling life. Before passing on the microphone to Laura, let me say a few words about the Paul B. Baltes Lecture. It is an annual lecture series that dates back to 2007 as a joint initiative of the Psychology Institutes in Berlin and Potsdam, that is the Freie Universität Berlin, the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, the Technische Universität Berlin, and the University of Potsdam, together with the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. It honors the late Paul B. Baltes, a former director at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, for his outstanding contributions to psychology and his relentless and successful efforts to foster collegiality and collaboration among psychologists in the Berlin-Potsdam area. We are deeply grateful to the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, which has been hosting our lecture in its premises for many years. I can think of no better place for this lecture as the Leibniz-Saal of the BBAW, and would like to thank its president, Professor Dr. Christoph Markschies, for his hospitality. I also would like to thank the Margaret M. and Paul B. Baltes Foundation, which has sponsored the reception that will take place after the lecture. And the reception will take place just here behind the slides that you will see in a short while. And there are also little leaflets that give you more information on the lecture. And I would like to give a special welcome to Professor Christine Windbichler, Paul's wife, and to Gavin Baltes, Paul's grandson, who are both in the audience today. A very warm welcome. This year's lecture has been co-hosted and co-organized by Humboldt-University and the MPI for Human Development. And after the lecture, my colleague Manuel Völkle from Humboldt-University will moderate the discussion, and he also will make sure that there is enough time left for the reception. But now it's your turn, Laura. We welcome you cordially in Berlin again and are looking forward to your lecture, Emotional Well-Being and Age, the Role of Shifting Time Horizons. Thank you so much.
You see why I love to come to Berlin. Nobody is as kind to me as Ullman and his colleagues and Donatella, and there's so many friends here that I see when I look out. I said to Ullman before, I'm going to start to name everyone, although then I'll forget to name someone, and I'm just so happy to see you all. I want to say a special thanks to the Max Planck Institute and Ullman Lindenberger and to Humboldt-University and Manuel Völkle for hosting this event tonight. It's amazing to be here. And before I talk about some research, I want to say a few words about Paul Baltes. And by the way, I have to say, when I just met you for the first time, Gavin, but I didn't know you were Paul's grandson. I heard Ullman say, you look a lot like Boris. And I said, yeah, you look a lot like Boris. I didn't know you were Boris's son. So nice to meet you. You do look a lot like Boris. It's great to meet and see again so many of you. So Paul Baltes, hands down, was more influential in the creation of the field that we are studying than anyone else in the field. And I don't think that's generally, I would say, arguably, or most people believe, but he created lifespan psychology. I mean, he generated the foundational principles that really guided the field. He argued and argued with child developmentalists who said there's no such thing as development in adulthood. And he was passionate, and he was influential, and he was persuasive. It might be hard to believe by some of the younger people entering the field that this was an issue, but that's how well it got resolved. And Paul was really responsible for so much of that. Of course, there were many other people, his colleagues, who worked with him on this, but Paul really was relentlessly attending to the issues. I thoroughly enjoyed being around Paul Baltes. He was as charming as he was formidable. What I remember about him, when I think about him and Margaret and the many times I came here, it was dinners at their house where there would be the best wine, delicious food, but the whole dinner was really a seminar being orchestrated by Paul Baltes, who was asking people questions and challenging them to argue with one another and to really generate some of the most interesting intellectual conversations I've ever been a part of. Having a really good Riesling or two before those dinners get underway really helped. Anyway, it was wonderful to know him, and he had a profound influence on me and my career. He argued with so many things that I thought and believed that I don't want to say. I don't have his stamp of approval on the things that I'll tell you tonight, but boy, did he influence how I thought. Really, really amazing. And he and Margaret were cherished friends who I will never, never forget. So you see why it's such a pleasure to be here with you. And I thank you all for coming out at night and the dark and the rain. What my plan is for this evening is to talk about a program of research that spans more than 30 years and really led to the development of socio-emotional selectivity theory and generated a lot of research where the findings fed back into the theory, and we learned how we were wrong, and we learned some areas where we were right, and we're trying to sort of continue to figure out a curious phenomenon. And that phenomenon is that older people are doing better emotionally than middle-aged and younger people are. It's referred to as the paradox of aging because nobody believed it. And when I say nobody, I was absolutely part of that. And I'm going to say a little bit about that in a minute and sort of why I think we believed that older people must be doing very badly, must be despairing. So I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about some of the evidence that kept coming, the empirical evidence that older people were doing well emotionally. And I'll talk about a little bit of that. I'll go to the theory, and this was a theory that was really instigated by these observations and how perplexed we all were about it. I'll show you some evidence, from studies testing the theory, and I'm going to end by talking a little bit about some evidence that doesn't support the theory, so that you know that when I say finding out we're wrong is really what moves the field forward, I mean it. So that's my plan. So I began my career with the aim of trying to help those poor older people who were lonely and depressed. That was absolutely where I was going. I got a degree both in lifespan developmental psychology and clinical psychology because I thought I had to be a clinical psychologist if I was going to help people who were aging. There were a lot of interventions going on at the time. I conducted some of those where we were trying to get older people to interact more, to have more friendships, more relationships. As it turned out from those interventions, it's clear that if you pay older people to talk to other people, they will. And when you stop paying them, they don't. So again, some of the evidence that was accumulating just didn't kind of add up. It wasn't that, oh, people get old and look, they're falling apart. But there were a lot of reasons for thinking this way. One big change was that in the 1970s and earlier and into the 80s, generally when people wanted to study older adults, they would go to nursing homes to find them for their samples, just like people who are studying middle school age children go to schools to find them. So that was the place people went. So an awful lot of early research was focused on a group of people who are a very small minority of older adults and doing quite poorly in terms of their physical health, also in terms of their cognitive health. But that was I think that was some of why we thought this must be really awful to get old. And then there were findings, and Margaret Baltes, I don't have a slide of Margaret's findings, but she found this and documented this in Germans decades before this study came out. But older people spend more time alone than any other age group. So again, you say, well, they're spending time alone. We know that people need social connections. They need relationships and stimulation, social stimulation. They're spending time alone. So that makes sense, right? That they would be lonely and despairing. And then occasionally people would say, well, you know, it can't be the case that older people are doing well because suicide rates are really high in older adults. So you're missing something in these studies. It's selection bias, it's some kind of problem. Can't be the case that older people are doing well because this high suicide rate. And this really did capture my attention when people were pointing this out. Because here's the evidence from CDC. You do see a spike, I should say, in suicide in older people. And I was curious, so I began to break this down. And here's the finding, is that white males show an increase in suicide. Now, suicide, thank goodness, is a low base rate behavior, so it's not very, we don't see high numbers. And these relatively small numbers of people made a big difference. So what we're seeing is that white males are at higher risk of suicide. As it turns down, when I dig into that, those numbers are white alcoholic males who own guns. That's kind of here. But look at every other group, other ethnicities, both males and females. Females, we're seeing lower rates of suicide. So again, I think people are so ready to believe that there must be something really terrible that we don't look as critically at evidence that older people might not be doing poorly. And then, of course, loneliness. We have a loneliness epidemic in the world. It affects our health. This is really a major challenge. And when people begin to think about loneliness, almost always the conversation turns to older adults because they're alone. They spend more time alone. They must be lonely. But actually, older people are less lonely than any other age group. Now, I don't mean to say, and I'll say this, I hope, repeatedly, it's not that older people are happy-go-lucky, nothing ever happens to them. When 27%, or about a quarter of a population, is experiencing persistent loneliness, that's a problem. But when we're saying it's age that's doing this, that's a problem. Because if you look at younger people, we see much higher rates of loneliness and anxiety and depression. Basically, any psychiatric disorder we see, except for the dementias, at higher rates in younger people than in older people. There was a recent publication in Psychological Sciences that concluded that age is related to the steady increase in loneliness. I was surprised when I saw this study come out because they used multiple data sets, SHARE and HRS and a lot of other ones. And they reported this curvilinear pattern of loneliness where middle age, people from early adulthood to middle age, you see a decline in loneliness, and they concluded that about 50, that's where you start to see this curve go up again. But the statistical approach they used, which was this curve fitting, forces an even curve, and we do see a spike in loneliness in people over 85. So well past average life expectancy, people generally who are close to the end of their lives, many people very sick at that time, we do see that. But it's not something that's increasing linearly from middle age to old age. It's really easy to believe, though. I still continue to think people just are so ready to believe these issues that we don't scrutinize the research quite as much as we should. We do scrutinize the research suggesting that older people are doing better because we don't believe it. And that, as it turns out, is one of the best things that happens in science. You want people to scrutinize findings that you present, that you find, because that's the way we make progress. We do want to critique these kinds of findings. But we tend to be really ready to believe the idea that older people are not doing well emotionally. I'm going to show you now some empirical evidence that older people might be doing better in addition to that loneliness reduction. So these are the kinds of findings that have just continued to appear. I'm just going to show you a few, but they're very consistent. These are findings from a study that Art Stone and his colleagues did. They used Gallup poll data, and the question is, yesterday, how much stress did you experience? And this is cross-sectional, a sample from 18 to over 85, and you see this kind of difference by age and how likely people are to report high levels of stress. You see the same thing for worry. You see the same thing for anger. Now, these kinds of findings have, as I say, been coming out for years. There's lots and lots of studies that if you just give people surveys, ask them how they're doing, or look at clinical diagnostic evidence, as I was saying, older people appear to be doing relatively well. But my group also didn't quite believe this. And also, what we started to think about was cohort effects and the possibility that the oldest generation is and always has been the greatest generation. So could that be what's accounting for this? Or do we actually see some kind of change over time in individuals? And so my group undertook, with the help of John Nesselrode and Neelam Ram and a number of other people, a longitudinal study of emotional experience in everyday life, where we used electronic pagers and sampled people at random times during the day for 1 week, and then followed them 5 years later, sampled again for 1 week, and 5 years later again, to look at within and between age differences in emotional well-being. They reported how the degree to which they were experiencing each of 19 different emotions, and some of those were negative emotions, anger, sadness, frustration, anxiety. Some were positive, joy, happiness, calm. And what we found was that, and these are now when we followed them over time. So we see this cross-sectionally, but these are longitudinal data where we see a fairly robust increase in what we call here emotional balance. What this means is, what you're seeing here are positive emotions, and you subtract the negative. So we just take the negative and then subtract how many positive. And so on balance, people are more positive than negative. And we see that kind of a trajectory. Again, it looks a little bit like we see a decline out here, and we don't look at it. This is because of the curve fitting. So we don't, if we actually break this down and look at it, it's not significant. But there are people, for example, Dennis Gersdorf, who would show in larger samples that this might be real. You might see this slight decline. At no point do you see older people doing more poorly emotionally than younger people. I mean, that's the age group that's really suffering. And I like to tell young people that every chance I get, because not only are younger people suffering often from psychiatric strains, we constantly say, and these are the best years of your life. It's no wonder people don't want to grow old. So I got the goods on this one. These are bad years emotionally. You're great in many other ways. Physically robust, fast, lots of things, good. But emotionally, no, this is not the best time in your life. Now, again, we and others have thought about what we might be doing wrong here. What are we missing? And Susan Charles, who is a former student of mine, a professor at UC Irvine, developed a model she calls SAVI, the Stress and Vulnerability Integration Model. And what Susan argues is that, yes, older people are doing better emotionally, but they have more control over their environments. They don't have to go work for a boss that they dislike or that is unpleasant to them. They can navigate their social world better than younger people can because they don't have the opportunity to do it in that way. But what Susan says is because of physiological changes, older people are more vulnerable to stress and reactivity if it's inescapable. So her thinking is people kind of, as you get older, you go about your life, you avoid the things you don't want to do, but boy, if you get in a situation where you have prolonged exposure to a stressor, you just decompensate. That's the strong version of this model. And Susan and I have talked about this a long time, and it's been a really influential model, and I think in part because everybody's ready to believe that. It's like, oh yeah, so now older people are doing better, but, there's a but to it. And here's the problem with the model, is it's really hard to test it empirically. I hope it never is, where we take older people and expose them to a prolonged stressor and see if they disintegrate emotionally. So that's not going to happen in an experiment. But as nature often does, it presented one, and that was called the COVID pandemic. And so during COVID, we thought we should now see if we're still seeing these emotional advantages in older people, because not only are older people more likely to now be isolated, more likely to die from the virus if they get it, this is the inescapable stress. And so we should take advantage of this and go and see how older people are doing. And when we surveyed older people, this is cross-sectional, during COVID, older people reported fewer negative emotions and more positive emotions. We don't typically see the more positive emotions in our research. But again, this was really curious. And we published this paper during COVID. There have to have been a dozen other surveys and studies where they found the same thing, different parts of the world. Older people were doing better emotionally during the pandemic than younger people were. Here's a recent findings from a recent study from a group at Harvard where cross-sectional again, but they compared people on surveys of happiness, close social relationships, character, meaning, and purpose, and just see these age differences, again, very much like the ones we're seeing, suggesting that older people are doing well emotionally. So the way I'm telling this story, it's as if all this happened and then I developed this theory, and of course it didn't happen that way. This was kind of a back and forth and developing the theory and seeing new findings and modifying the theory in various ways and so on. But now I'm going to just turn to the theory and tell you a story about what I thought might be happening that could account for these more positive emotional profiles despite the many very real challenges people face as they grow older. I have to start saying as we grow older. So there we go. Socio-emotional selectivity theory is a theory that's really grounded in the uniquely human ability to monitor time. And lots of species monitor time, clock time, calendar time. So we know that this monitoring or responsiveness to time we see across species. But humans, to the best of our knowledge, are the only species that track our place in the life cycle through most of our lives. We are aware that we're mortal. We know that at some point this life runs out. And we know when we're young, we probably in all likelihood have a vast future ahead of us, and as we get older, like me, you start to say, well, it's not, you just remind it, it's not, it's not going to go on forever. According to this theory, goals are always set in temporal context, always. You can't pursue a goal outside of some kind of temporal context. And because chronological age is associated with time left, we see systematic changes in goals. So what's different about this theory is it's not a theory about age differences due to how many years it's been since you were born, as many developmental theories are, how we change over time. It's about how we change as we systematically see a shorter future, more constraints on future time. So the way thinking goes here is that when people are young, time seems to stretch out infinitely. Initially, I thought when we started this work that young people thought a lot about how much time they have in their futures. And what I've come to think because of the work we've done is that it's not that, it's that younger people don't think about time at all. You know, it's like, I got plenty of time. I can have this career, I can do this, I can do that, without seeing this sort of pressure of time. And when your presumption, tacitly or explicitly, is that you have a long and nebulous future, the primary motivations that people pursue, or the primary goals, are ones about preparing for this future. So younger people are in a motivational state to explore, to collect people, information, knowledge, contacts. Even if they're not important today, they might be important one day. So there's this preparatory kind of a motive. We try new things. It turns out that if we don't enjoy them, there'll be plenty of time to try other things. And so we're quite open when we're young to pursue lots of activities and take chances, even when there might be some risk to our emotional well-being. We might go to a cocktail party, a gathering, even though nobody likes those, right? I mean, you stand around, is there somebody to talk to you, things. But younger people are much more likely to do that. And they'll say things, it's something like fear of missing out. It's the, I might meet my soulmate might be there. So, I don't may necessarily want to go, but I'm gonna go. I might not get something that other people are getting. So young people take these kinds of chances, and as we get older, we're less likely to do that because we're less likely to be thinking about what we need to do to prepare for a long future, and more likely to think about the kinds of goals and motives that we have in the moment. So when our time horizons change, we change our goals. We come to live in the moment. We know better what's important and what's not important. We come to invest in sure things. We come to deepen the relationships we have with other people. We start to savor life. We start to savor last times. And probably even more than actual last times, we begin to recognize that there's a fragility to life and that could be the last time. So you see an old friend and you think, that could be the last time I ever see that person. And it's not morbid, it just makes those experiences more precious. And so we begin to invest in things that feel good. We invest in goals that are emotionally meaningful. And when we live our lives pursuing goals that are about emotional meaning and purpose, life feels better. We did some work on long-term marriages, John Gottman and Bob Levinson and I, years ago. And Levinson continued to follow those couples over time. And it turns out older couples are happier with their marriages than younger couples are. And the finding I love about the longitudinal data is that even unhappily married couples are more satisfied with their marriages over time when they're old than they were when they were young. They come to feel like they're really proud of having survived this horrible relationship. But they really, but they're seriously, it's like, I stood by her, And so when we begin to prioritize what we have and to ignore many of the more trivial problems and worries that engulfed us when we were younger, we are more open to the reconciliation, we're more grateful for life, and life feels better. So that's the storyline of socio-emotional selectivity theory. Here's a better model of it as we think about this. So the premise is that goals are always set in temporal context, and that there are basically two classes of goals we talk about, social goals. And those classes of goals are goals about meaning and satisfaction and goals about exploration and learning. And what we argue, which often gets lost, I think, and I'm sure that we're not clear enough about this in our writing, but both of these kinds of goals we think of as primarily motivating behavior throughout life. So it's not that older people don't care about learning or younger people don't care about emotional well-being. Both of these kinds of goals are important, but we set them goals. The thing that determines which ones we're going to pursue relate to time horizons. How much time do we have? And that we're more likely to pursue goals about learning and exploration when time horizons are long, and more likely to choose goals about emotional meaning and satisfaction when time horizons are short. This is how we think about the life course shift in goals over time. It was age that really motivated this theory and thinking. I have to forget that I can't walk away from it, about shifts in goals. But there are many kinds of changes that affect our time horizons other than age. Sometimes younger people get sick, and their time horizons come to look like older people's time horizons. But we also sometimes move to another country or across a country, and we've seen similar kinds of changes there. We've seen changes in the laboratory just by having people imagine shorter and longer time horizons. And what happens is that when younger people are imagining these shorter time horizons, they come to look motivationally very much like older people, and older people like younger people when they're imagining longer time horizons than they typically do. So this is what we think is happening across life, but it's not just aging that affects these. We think there's something more core to time horizons. And there's a body of research that I've just been reading recently about endings, all sorts of endings. And it looks like people try to end conversations, relationships, interactions on a positive note. There was a study recently published by Derek Zakowitz's group where people played a game. This was all young people. This was not a study about aging at all. But people were playing a game where they had to place bets and win or lose money on these bets. And some of the players in one condition knew when the study would end, so they knew when they were approaching the last chance, the last bet. And another condition they didn't, they just were playing the game. And in the condition where people knew they were approaching the last possible bets, they made bigger bets. They were taking bigger chances to win a lot of money. It was like, I'm gonna really try to end this with a big bang. You know, that's what it looked like in there. So we're seeing something about endings and the approach of endings that looks like this could be more general than something related to development. So it's really hard to measure motivation. It's really hard to ask people in surveys, what are your goals? You know, why are you here this evening? And you might tell yourself you're here because you want to be intellectually stimulated, but really you're here because you're sitting next to your friend, you know, or you got out of doing something else, or, you know, we just don't know what our motives are. I actually think this is one of the things, you know, that Freud was really right about, that it's really hard for people to have this kind of insight into what's motivating us. And so we really struggled with this. Could we really find a way to assess whether goals are different at different ages and under different temporal contexts? And at one point, we decided to do something that behavioral economists often do, and that's to develop a paradigm about preferences. So economists will infer goals, desires, from preferences given an array of options. And so what we did was to develop a social choice paradigm where people are asked to choose which of the following social partners would you like to spend 30 minutes with. And these were not arbitrary. We did a lot of pre-testing and card sorting and cluster analyses and so on to find out that these are ways that people organize social partners. There are novel, ones that are full of information. Some partners, a recent acquaintance, where there might be the fantasy of a future, and then there are close, well-known social partners that we're emotionally connected to. And so the paradigm goes like this. We say to younger, older, middle-aged people, imagine you have 30 minutes free. The following 3 people are available to you. Which one do you choose to spend time with? That's this very simple study. And what we find is that a very large percentage of older people say they want to spend time with family members. And younger people's responses are kind of randomly, evenly distributed across these options. But we see this strong preference for spending time with close people and older adults. And you say, well, that could be because nobody else is nice to older people except their old friends. Maybe they don't have the energy to get out there and meet. So there are lots of reasons you could use to explain there. We thought it was time. And so in a second condition, sometimes within, sometimes between subjects, we said, now I want you to imagine you're about to move across country. You're going by yourself without family or friends. Which one of these people would you got 30 minutes free? Who do you choose? And now young people look just like old people. So younger people are to the same percentages now choosing this emotionally close social partner. And we thought, well, this is cool. We've made young people into old people just with this simple time horizon manipulation. I wonder if we could get old people to look like young people. And so we used a different kind of manipulation. This time we said, imagine you just got a phone call from your physician who told you about a new medical advance that virtually ensures you'll live about 20 years longer than you expected in relatively good health. Who would you like to spend time? You have 30 minutes free. Who would you like to spend time with? And older people do not want to spend time with their family anymore. In fact, in one study, they were less likely to choose than younger people were. Now, those older people were still old, and those younger people were still young. The only thing we changed was the time horizon. So we thought there's something to time. And we ran a lot of these studies. And I have to say, Helene Feng, a former student of mine who's a professor at the Chinese University in Hong Kong, has done so many of these studies. She's really the one that has led this, but it's been replicated many, many times in many different countries, and we still see these kinds of age differences, and you can eliminate them with time horizon changes. But they are hypothetical, right? So you can say, well, yeah, but it's trivial. That's not really what happens. You're asking people to imagine something. And so, but we'd run enough of these studies that events in life began to occur, like the SARS epidemic in Hong Kong broke out. And Helene had run so many of these studies in Hong Kong, she kind of had a baseline. And then she put the same choice out during the SARS epidemic, and younger people now look like older people. There were no more age differences. Recently, I was approached by a researcher, a former student of Hal Hirschfield's, who reached out to me during the COVID pandemic and said, those age differences should be eliminated now. And she had some baseline data and compared age differences. We didn't see age differences in this question during the height of the COVID pandemic. And then when the vaccines became available, younger people now look like younger people again. They were going out. So we saw that happen also, both during SARS and then during COVID, where those age differences were no longer significant. We've also seen it with terrorism. I was in New York on 9/11, many years ago now, visiting my sister, and Helene calls right the next morning, and she says, we got to do a study. And I said, I don't give a damn about data. I'm not interested in any way. And mortality had just been primed for me very much more so than apparently Helene. She went ahead anyway, collected the data, and we saw the same thing happen there. It looks like when these external events occur, the age difference disappear for about 6 months, and then we start to see them again. Being reminded of an ending, in this case mortality, seems to prime this shift in preferences. So we know that older people spend more time alone. Older people have smaller social networks. And Frieder Lang and I had observed this in the base data many years ago, in the late 90s, published a paper showing that social networks were smaller in older people, but they weren't randomly smaller. It looked like older people had as many close social partners as younger people did. It was this more external partners, more peripheral acquaintances and so on had fewer of them in their networks, but just as many core social partners. Tammy English and I observed the same thing in a much younger sample. This was the sample in the experience sampling study where they were carrying these pagers. We saw the same thing over time where social networks got smaller, but they were, this green line are the inner circle. This is using Tony Antonucci's concentric circle paradigm, where you, in the inner circle, those are the people that you say you can't imagine life without. And we don't see a change in how many of those people are in the networks. What we see are more reductions in outer circles, more peripheral people in life. So it looks like people, we suspected people are pruning their social networks, keeping those really close partners in those networks and letting more peripheral, less familiar relationships go. That's what it looks like. And Frieder and I had seen the same thing in an older sample. What we did in this study was to look at emotional well-being. And emotional well-being is getting better when people are honing their networks in this way. So when your social world consists of people who are predictable, you know them well, in many cases you love them, you've known them a long, long time, and that's the core social network that you have, people are doing better emotionally. What I've been talking about are studies that were done to look at social preferences and social networks, social relationships. Many years ago now, 20 years ago to be precise, Mara Mather appeared in my laboratory as a postdoc. And Mara is a cognitive psychologist and had been doing some work on choice preferences, and that older people tended to remember more positively the choice that they made. You decide to buy a car, and you pick a car, and if you ask people later, are they satisfied with that purchase, older people everybody's more positive. So we have this hindsight kind of preference that we see, but older people showed that more. So we started thinking about selectivity theory and changes in goals, and began to do some research about the effect of motivation or shifts in goals may have on cognitive processing, or I should say the allocation of cognitive resources. Goals direct our attention, our memory. These are goals related. If you walked into this building and you were looking for this room, you might walk right past a friend of yours, and if you were looking for your friend, you wouldn't have found the room. So our goals are directing our attention and our focus to things that are consistent with those goals. So Helene Fung, person who's done so many of these social preferences studies, and I decided to run a study where we asked people to review a number of advertisements and to see if older people were more likely to remember advertisements framed in emotional terms, promising an emotional reward if you buy the product versus informational or exploratory rewards. So I'll give you an example here of what we did. We presented ads. We worked with an advertising agency to produce these, and we made them in pairs, and they were identical except for the slogan. So what you see here is a camera ad, and it says capture the unexplored world in one, and in the other, in the pair, it says capture those special moments. Another example, here's a watch ad, successes within reach, don't let time pass you by, or take time for the ones you love. Don't let time pass you by. And we presented these to older and younger people, and we asked them for which ones they liked better. Older people liked the emotional ads better than younger people do, or the emotional slogans, but they remembered the products and the slogans better when they were framed in emotional terms as opposed to exploratory terms. And Mara, Susan Charles, and I, Susan was there now as a visiting scientist, and Mara shows up as a postdoc, and we started to think about valence of memory. So if goals are directing our attention and memory, emotional goals, would positive information be better remembered, encoded, attended to than negative information. And we did not have a theoretical hypothesis about this. We thought it could be that if you're motivated to engage in emotionally meaningful interactions, could be negative, could be positive. It didn't necessarily, we didn't know. So we asked the research question, but we did wonder if there might be a valenced effect here. And so we began to run studies, some focused on memory, some focused on attention, some including neuroimaging, and after a while, a lot of people were looking at this question. And what emerges from these findings is that we see a preference for positive information in attention and memory in older adults. And that appears to be a relatively reliable finding. And many different studies in many different laboratories asking very different kinds of questions, we see this preference for positive. I'm going to show you, just to give you an example of the kind of thing we've done. In one study, we show people images, not all at once. They're seeing these images slide by slide on a computer screen. And in an incidental memory paradigm, we ask them afterwards, write down, tell us, you remember we showed you all those images? Remember, write down all the ones you remember. And what we see is that younger people remember even numbers of the positive and the negative. By middle age, we're already seeing this preference for positive in memory. And in older people, we're seeing this whopping effect for a preference for, they're remembering the positive images and not the negative images. And I have to say here too, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. I'm walking away. These are neutral images in the beige. And look what happens here in older adults. I mean, they're just not remembering any of the neutral images. And what this made me think about, and Oman, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but in many cognitive aging studies, researchers bend over backwards to generate neutral stimuli because you wouldn't want some people to be more familiar with them than others. So you come up with these abstract, insignificant kinds of stimuli. And apparently that doesn't work for older people. At least it's working against memory. This study was memory, but we thought, well, from that study, it could be attention and not memory. So maybe people aren't encoding this at all. A number of studies have been run using what's called a dot probe paradigm, where again, people come into the laboratory, sit in front of a computer screen, and what's presented on the computer screen are two faces. It's always the same person, and always one facial pose is neutral. And then the other would be positive or negative. And what happens is people look at the computer screen, they see these faces appear for half a second, they disappear. I'm out of order here. They disappear and there's a dot behind one of the faces and not the other. And the only thing the participant has to do is to press a key to the left or the right of the keyboard saying where the dot was. So if someone was oriented to the positive face, they'd be faster pressing that key than if it was actually behind the other face. That's the way that this dot probe test works. What you're seeing here, sorry, kind of out of order, is this is how they're trained. They're trained on a cross, so we get people in the laboratory. They come and we say, start by looking at this cross in the middle of the screen, so they're not already directing their attention in one direction or another. Two faces appear, it disappears, and then you see this dot. And that's when they hit a key on the left or the right. And there we also see findings where younger people are, essentially as fast, whether it's the dot is behind a positive or a negative, paired with a positive or a negative face. But older people are faster to the positive and slower to the negative faces. As I say, there have been a lot of studies. What was great about this finding is that cognitive psychologists got interested in the phenomenon. And they do a really good job in experiments and teasing apart different kinds of influences. I'm going to tell you that right now, today, we're not exactly sure what is really at the root of this positivity preference. And it could be something that's neural, it could be something that's driven by some other kind of influence than time. Horizons, what I can tell you is that the experiment came from the theory, and we're now still trying to figure out, what is the cause of it. Sarah Barber, a former student of Mara Mather's, induced endings. and did an induction where people thought about their own mortality and then presented them with the dot probe task. And younger people now look like older people in their responses. So at least one study, I think there are 2 now that have done that, where they did a manipulation and saw it. But there's a lot of evidence now that we see differences in cognitive processing. I keep saying cognitive processing, and you know, the voice I hear in my head is Paul saying, it's not cognitive processing, it's preferences. Preferences in attention and memory is where we see those differences. They're motivational. It's not that somehow in fundamental ways cognition is changing, but people are attending to different kinds of information at different ages. That's what it looks like. So I get a lot of help from my friends, and you know, your very best friends are the ones who can really criticize you. They care about you enough in your work to say, I don't get it. And I've benefited from that in so many ways and from so many people in this room, so thank you. But I also have economist friends, and I was talking about these findings to Alan Garber, who's now president of Harvard, but he was at Stanford before that, an economist. And I'm telling him about this positivity preference, and he says, that's really interesting, Laura. And he goes, now make me care. Darn, you know. And so we thought we did. And first we started doing some studies with money and the how much people attended to winning and losing money. And we see this positivity preference operate. But then we did another study recently where, not that recently, I guess you can say, when it's 2014. I'm going to show you a more recent one momentarily. But this was a study that Nana Nothoff and I ran when she was a graduate student at Stanford. And what we did was to recruit a group of older people in a study that was ostensibly on exercise and walking. We gave people pedometers. They walked for a few days, they came back to the laboratory, and then we assigned them randomly to one of 2 different groups. In one group, we asked them to walk for another 30 days, and every day we sent them messages about the positive outcomes of walking. And in the other group, people are randomly assigned to, we sent them messages about the dangers of not exercising, of not walking. And what you see here is over 30 days, how walking changed in the experimental group, those receiving gain messages from walking, and we just didn't see a change in those in the condition where they were receiving sort of warnings about not walking in that condition. In another study, this was also on walking, this one actually is more recent, we recruited a wide age range of participants from early 20s to 80s for a study on walking. The participants came into the laboratory, we gave them a pedometer, and we got a baseline level of walking for 1 week. At the end of that, they come back to the laboratory and we said, you've been chosen, if you choose, to participate in another phase of the study. And this time, what you'll do is you'll receive 5 cents for every step you take over your baseline over the next week. The graduate student who's leading this study, Candace Hogan, came into my office one day and said, I think we're going to go broke. What we found is that in a number of these conditions, we saw no age difference, like winning for yourself. Oh, I'm sorry. So in one condition, they can win money for themselves. In another condition, they can earn money for a loved one. In another condition, on and on. But one was a charity. And what we found is that essentially young people don't walk for charities, but older people do. So this was the one condition where we really saw this robust effect. And it made us think about prosociality. So are older people more prosocial? And there has been some writing in the literature that that is the case, but there's very little empirical evidence for it. That is, are older people more likely to help others? And if that's the case, the worlds we're living in today have this maybe the only natural resource that's actually growing, older people. But imagine a world where we have increasingly more people who care about the welfare of others. We looked at the literature, and there were only 3 studies at the time, ours being one of them, But there were two others. They were very different. One was a study that Ulrich Marr, formerly here at MPI, and a colleague of his had run. That's this middle panel, where participants, a large age range, are in a scanner, and what they're seeing are monetary transfers being given to themselves or a charity. And what you see is an age interaction where older people are showing greater amygdala activation and insular activation, so neural activation in reward centers when money's being given to the charity than when it's being given to themselves. Not so in younger people. Interesting evidence for pro-social that's not self-report. What you see over here is our study where we were looking at walking for a charity. This was a really interesting study published by a woman named Jo Cutler and her colleagues. And she did a study during COVID that had 46,000 participants in it and 67 countries. And the paradigm went like this. She calculated the average income in that country, so the amount varied. And it was 1 week's salary, basically, on average for that particular country. And she asked the participant, imagine you just received this windfall. How much of it would you give to a charity? And what you see here, globally reliable, is that older people are saying they would give more of that to a charity. My group started to think about older workforces. So we hear a lot about aging workforces. There's a lot of concern about productivity, and there's some evidence that if you measure productivity at the individual level, and that's measured by a manager sitting across and talking to a person, that older people are less productive. Now, some of that is a little problematic because productivity factors in your salary. So if Ullman makes the same number of widgets as one of your 30-year-old students, you're still not as productive because I'm paying you more, right? So that's kind of how that gets factored, and that's part of why people say older people aren't as productive. But if you look at the team level, the unit level, there's an interesting phenomenon, and it looks like the presence of older workers increases the productivity of younger workers. Think universities. It kind of is the model, has been the model for a long time. And in conversations we were having with people who are labor economists, they were saying they thought that it may be related to older people mentoring younger people, and we thought pro-sociality, is that what's happening? And there might be two things. Older people are more emotionally balanced than younger people are, and more pro-social, and you put those two things together and it could be really good for workplace productivity. So we ran a study. This first study was this is the future workforce, by the way. It really is going to be age diverse, already is, where we've got 6 birth cohorts in the workforce at the same time. And it's going to be like that for forever, people think. So we set up a preference paradigm that was very similar to that social preference paradigm that I described to you, where we said to people, you come to work one day and you have 3 different projects available to you. One is going to advance your own career, one is going to help the company realize a goal, and the other one is helping a colleague. You come to work one day, which one do you choose? That's the basic paradigm. And we look at young, middle-aged, and older workers. So these are all people in the workforce. And what you're seeing here in the red, young, middle-aged, and older people, and the red is helping a friend. So older workers come to work and are much more likely to say, I want to help someone at work than younger people are. Younger people are very interested, as they should be, in advancing their own careers. Older people are interested in helping others at work. We said, if this is time horizons, we might be able to eliminate that effect. And so we said, imagine you come to work one day, you hear your contract's been extended for another decade, You have 3 projects available you can work on. Which one do you choose? And that age effect is gone. Now older workers are not so interested in working or helping younger colleagues. We've now done a number of other surveys and and began to study workers, actual workers. This was done online, and instead we're collecting data day to day, sometimes using daily experience sampling studies, sometimes using daily recollection methods where we ask people to parse the day into different pieces, morning, middle, early, morning, later, and ask them if they were helping or if they were learning. What we predicted, by the way, is that older people would be learning less at work, but helping more. What we find is that older people are helping more, and they are not learning less. In fact, there's a lot of learning that goes on when people help, so those 2 things are not as cleanly distinguished in these. But we see repeatedly now, we've seen this in 4 different workplaces, a large bank, a wealth advisory firm, a publishing house, and we're seeing really reliable, and now a technology company we've just collected pilot data from. We also have data from the unit at Stanford University that oversees land and buildings, and we see it there too. So we're seeing older workers help more than younger workers do. How am I on time?
Just right. 2 more minutes.
You want 5? I will wrap in 5. I wanted to end with something telling you about something that just wasn't working the way we expected it would. And what we're trying to do to see if we might be able to learn more by changing some of the ways we measure something. So real quickly here. Every time we've done an experimental study where we manipulate time horizons in the laboratory, we use imaging, or we ask people to imagine different kinds of temporal scenarios and ask them to make choices, we have replicated these age differences, every study. Years ago, when I was here at MPI, Frieder Lang and I developed a measure of future time horizons that has been widely used now in the field that ask people about how long time horizons are and how likely they are to have time to realize their goals. We developed this measure only so we could see if there's a relationship between age and time horizons, because that's so fundamental to this theory. But it's become used in lots of surveys to examine well-being. And when you use that measure, it does not predict what we would expect, that is, shorter time horizons predicting better, greater well-being. And it's not just that there's no relationship there, it's a strong negative relationship. That is, people who perceive long futures, not short futures, are in better emotional well-being. So we thought, is this a theoretical challenge? Do we need to really rethink this time horizon mechanism that we've been talking about, or is it something to do with the scale? So we went back and we looked at this future time horizon scale, a 10-item scale, and it has questions on it like, my future seems infinite to me, most of my life lies ahead of me. Those are the kinds of questions. And also questions like, I have a sense that goals are, I don't have time, or I do have time to fulfill and realize my goals. Those are the kinds of questions. None of the questions on this survey have anything to do with the psychological reasoning posited by socio-emotional selectivity theory, which is that as time becomes more constrained, people savor time more. So there was nothing about the experience of time and how people perceived time in their lives. And so we spent, and those of you who develop scales, bless you, because we don't so much in my lab, but boy is it hard. So after a couple years, we come up with a 4-item scale that taps the psychology and selectivity theory that should be accounting for feeling better. So if you're finding time as precious, if you know that bad times pass, if you're not wasting time on trivial matters, and you're valuing time more, then we thought that should positively predict or mediate the age difference that we see in well-being. And that does work. So what we see here is there's this strong relationship, as I've been arguing all evening, between age and emotional well-being. The future time perspective, the future time horizon measure is negatively related to age, as we thought it would be, but long time horizons predict emotional well-being, not short. The savoring scale is also correlated with age, but it moderates, and we've run this in multiple samples, and it either partially mediates or fully mediates the relationship between age and emotional well-being. So we're trying. The measure and the paper surrounding it is now in press in Psychology and Aging, and we're just hoping that people will use it and see if it works or not. Is it different than future time horizons when you add the emotional kind of quality to it, or is there something really wrong fundamentally about how we've been thinking about these things? I will say that I do deeply believe that the way science moves forward is by finding out we're wrong. And if we can figure out how we're wrong, then we start to really make progress. So we've been wrong many times, but we're hoping that other people and other labs and research groups around the world will start to ask some of these similar questions and let us know how it goes. And I just want to end by saying again how deeply grateful I am to so many of you here tonight, and to the Max Planck Institute and Paul Baltes. I would not be doing the work that I'm doing were it not for MPI and for Paul Baltes in particular. Thank you, Christine, for being here too. Thank you all.
Dear Laura, wonderful. Thank you so much for this fascinating and truly inspiring lecture. Thanks so much. Considering our time horizon, I'm sure there are questions.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks a lot for this very inspiring talk. I would like to pick up on the social part of your SST and pick up on one of the findings that you had been referring to, the conjoint work with Frieda Lang on the Berlin Aging Study. Two of the founders of the Berlin Aging Study are in the audience. Welcome. I always use those in my introductory lectures for undergraduate classes. So we see that there's a negative age gradient in the social network size, but the developmental action is basically only happening in the outer circles, circle 2 and 3, but no action basically in the most inner circle. You had referred to this, and you are calling this kind of selective pruning, that people are chopping off the outer circles and remaining the most inner ones closely tied. So one of the things that always comes up in those introductory classes, okay, so these data have been collected in the early 1990s. So how do things look like some 30 years later? Back when the Berlin Aging Study was initiated, something like smartphones had still not been around, and we know that old age is getting younger as compared with aging in the 1990s. So what would be your answer to the question of what can we still see, what is similar to the pattern that had been obtained in the early 1990s, and what may have changed since then?
Thank you. In general, I think as people live longer, we're going to see these age shifts stretch out. So I think we'll see them appear later in lives as opposed to earlier, just because people's time horizons are longer now. So you turn 60 today, it's different. Your time horizon feels different than it did in 1950 when you turned 50. You know, so I think things are changing. But the real answer to your question is a meta-analysis that was published by an author where the last name is Ruse, does somebody know? Z-U-R-S, I think. And she has like 100 plus studies globally collected, and she sees these same patterns. And those studies have been done on very different timescales, some more recent, some older. And so it looks like it's fairly robust, that we're seeing the age difference. Now, whether that's stretching out, you know, a few years since the 90s is I don't know the answer to, but it does look like we're seeing that kind of pruning process, if you will, go on in lots of countries. I mean, I don't know a country that isn't showing that. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So another question related to that in my lectures on this issue is, well, are these positivity effects only because of selective samples? Mm-hmm. So the old ones who participate in these studies are maybe the well-educated, the more healthy, the more positive people. Mm-hmm. So how representative are these findings?
Yeah. I think it's a great point, and that it is part of research on aging writ large. There are selection effects, and who participates, there are selection effects, and who's still alive. And so, yes, we do see selection, and really can't rule that out. What I will say is in the longitudinal study that my colleagues and I collected, and that's the one we ran the social network analysis on, and that's where that we collected the daily emotional experience. That was a sample that we spent a couple years constructing and hired a survey research firm to do it, where we had comparable numbers of blue-collar workers and white-collar workers, and we stratified race and gender across the age range and 5-year segments. And so we had, at least I can say, we had blue-collar and white-collar. It wasn't all highly educated, highly affluent people who participated. And the responses that we see in that are very similar to what we see in the broader literature. But I don't think anybody can really rule out selection effects completely. I mean, I'm convinced enough that we're getting something that's reasonably representative that I still do this work. But I mean, the master of selection effects and understanding them is standing over here, Ullman Lindenberger. And is there a way to really just eliminate selection effects from the field?
No, I don't think so. There are ways of studying them,
yeah.
And then they actually can become an interesting source of information. But I think what you can do when you run studies is to make sure that the kind of selection is about the same across different age groups. So, for instance, looking at positively selected groups across the age range, then makes you more confident that what you see is reflecting age rather than a differential selection effect. Yeah. I actually had a question.
And since you have the microphone.
No, the microphone I really had to.
Oh, is that okay?
But it's a question about aging scientists. So
Uli and I were talking about that before earlier.
So there is this shift in the balance between motives that are about seeking new information and motives that are about savoring life, let's say, just to make it brief. And I wonder to what extent this shift is domain-specific. So in the sense that it applies, for instance, to social relations, but that, for instance, a scientist, age 80, is still, when it comes to the domain of science, is still very much tilted towards showing new things. Now, you may say that this is kind of trivial because this is what science is about, but I think what my general question is whether these shifts that one observes in general are modulated by the domain that you are looking at. And I'm just...
I expect so. However, I thought you were going in a slightly different direction, where theoretically what's happening is that we see these age differences, time horizon differences, when goals compete. And there are some times where goals don't compete. So, and the reason I say this in response to your good question that I'm not answering is that for scientists, a discovery time in the lab, working on an important problem, is emotionally meaningful. And it's also very much related to, I mean, it's not only learning, it's generating new knowledge. And theoretically, both of these goals are highly valued and operate throughout life. Where we see the differences is when they compete. So, you know, what I say is an example, young people will take inorganic chemistry. And by the way, my apologies to the chemists who love inorganic chemistry here. But most people don't find that fascinating. Younger people take it, they work very hard in it, and the reason they're taking it is it opens doors for them into another profession. You don't see a lot of 80-year-olds in inorganic chemistry. And I think that's the kind of trade-off. So it doesn't mean as we get older we're not interested in learning. And this is, again, I'm getting back to, so it would depend on domain, I expect, and the extent to which learning and pursuing meaningful goals compete with one another.
And in this case, they don't. Yeah.
And yes.
Yeah. So you actually answered my question. I just posed it wrongly, yes.
Oh, do you see what a gracious person he is? It was the wrong question. I gave the right answer, but it was the wrong question. Yes.
Thank you so much for your very illuminating talk.
Thank you.
Would you venture a guess as to the possible roots or causes of these differing dispositions across age groups? And secondly, I remember reading an article, most likely, but I don't remember very clearly, most likely by Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Tversky, in which, so they asked participants, so the situation was a purchase situation, and participants were asked to choose between two rewards. One was given immediately, and the other situation was a greater reward, but to be given at a later point in time.
Right.
And participants from all age groups, 8 out of 10 of them went for immediate reward. So as I was listening to your talk, these studies came to my mind, and I thought maybe it would be nice if you could opine on.
I've thought a lot about those studies too, and talked with Amos when he was still with us about those studies and those findings. And I think they're very much related to young people. So almost all those studies on, this is delay of gratification in some sense, right? So you can get a big monetary reward in the future, or you can get a smaller, but you can immediate monetary reward, and people tend to take the short-term immediate reward. And what we know about older people is that you see much more delayed discounting in older people with money. And so why would that be? I mean, they're being much more, they're making the right choice, if you will. And we thought that's because older people are really used to investing. They understand, they've seen compounding over the years, they understand finances better. That might be part of it. But we also thought, well, that's money. So we ran some studies that we haven't published, but we have conducted some studies where instead of the delay being monetary, the delay is social. So you could have a visit from your niece tomorrow for 3 days, or next year for a whole week. And older people pick 3 days tomorrow. And younger people are more likely to delay that later. So I think that's another example to Ulman's point about domain. Yes. Yeah, and where we see that. It's a really, at least I think it's an interesting question myself. Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask a question. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. First of all. Second of all, you talked about time horizons, age, and time savoring.
Yeah.
And this thought just came to me. So I'm from Ukraine, and people in Ukraine understand the time horizons and the fact that life can end really shortly. So we savor time more. Yep. And my question would be, do we tend to look like old people more in this case because we are generally closer to the, I would label this as surviving environment. So like, do we look like do we look like them more? Because we survive also, so to say, generally as much as old people kind of have to survive.
Yeah.
That would be my question.
What a great question, and I'm so sorry for what's happening to your country.
Thank you.
I expect that younger people, younger Ukrainians, are pursuing emotionally meaningful goals to comparable level that older people are now. That's what I would predict. I wouldn't predict that people are doing better emotionally in Ukraine right now. So, but emotionally meaningfulness, yes, which is what's really driving the kinds of things, as I was saying. I think it's meaningfulness that's driving the improvements in emotional well-being. In the conditions now in Ukraine, that's kind of impossible, right? But yes, my guess is that people are making those kind of meaningful choices. You know, one of the things we're hearing about are these relationships among Ukrainians, getting married, how important it is to have these close relationships and pursue them. And some people are saying, what, in the middle of a war, you want to take that kind of risk? And it's like, yes, that's exactly what I want to do. Same thing happened after 9/11. 9/11 in New York City saw, right after 9/12, let me say, not 9/11, people started getting married at much higher rates than they were before. And what I think is happening is time horizons get short. You say, life is short. I'm going to do what really is most important to me. And so we saw that kind of thing. I later heard there were also a lot of divorces and breakups right after. And so it made me think, you kind of look at the person across from you and you go, I don't think this is, you know, if life is short, I'm leaving. Or life is short, I'm with you. So I think it does. I think those are conditions where we start to make choices based on what feels right today. Yeah. Thank you.
In the Berlin aging study, we learned a lot about differential agings.
Yes.
A lot of examples.
Yeah.
What about this phenomenon in your research?
Yeah. Yeah, there's clearly individual differences that we're seeing in this, and not everybody's doing well emotionally. All of the findings that we're reporting are relative to younger people. So the pandemic, for example, was really hard emotionally on everybody, regardless of age. So it's not like it was a good time, but it was a time, what we were arguing is it was a time where older people were at special risk, and they were doing relatively better than younger people who were at lower risk. And so that's the kind of thing we're suggesting. But even so, I mean, there's a lot of variability in these things. I would absolutely not claim that time horizons are the only thing that are leading to people making choices or changes. I personally find that when people try to do that with a theory, it just does, it's like, of course, there are many different influences. So there's lots of variability. What I do think we're seeing is a trend line. And the trend line, I think, is important because it's running against people's sort of everyday notions of what aging is like. And I don't think we should be thinking older people are doing well emotionally because we need it or they need it or any of that. I think it's because there are older people who aren't doing well emotionally. And when you go into your physician's office and you say, I'm not doing well emotionally, and your physician says or thinks, well, what do you expect? You're 80 years old. You don't get help. So I think what we need to recognize from this is not typical. So that means when people aren't doing well, to know it's not typical. So that's how I interpret these.
Yeah. Same thing in Germany.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, there's that joke where this 90-year-old man goes to see his doctor and he says, you know, my right leg is just really giving me trouble. It just hurts all the time. And the doctor says, well, what do you expect? That leg is 90 years old. And the guy says, yeah, but my left leg's 92. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the amazing talk. I wonder if anybody has told you about this thinking. Do you think the emotional positivity is, after all, just an illusion, the kind of helplessness when people think they have limited time left and they start to accept the whole negativity and try to see that as a positivity? So what I mean is, after all, it's all acceptance of the negativity rather than, and then transition it to an illusional positivity.
So denial is what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. The psychiatrists, when these findings first started to come out, called it masked depression. because people were saying they didn't have these symptoms, and the psychoanalysts were saying, oh, it's there, you're just not seeing it. And actually, the more they tell you that they're doing well, the more you should be. So, okay, at this point, we have studies using neuroimaging where we can look at neural activation in response to positive and negative stimuli. You see activation in response to positive, but not to negative. And lots of studies like that, using many different kinds of methods where we're still seeing it. So I think your question is good, and I think we should always wonder about that, especially with self-report. But there are measures that have been used in many studies that aren't self-report. And then when you see the same kinds of patterns, I think people start to say, yeah, there might be something there. It's a really good question and should be asked. Yeah, thank you.
So quick question and quick answer, if possible.
Uh-oh. You think I can do a quick answer? Okay.
Maybe this is
I will.
not the right question. It might be another lecture. Do you have any information or study in your lab how media is influencing emotional well-being of
I think it is a different talk. I think and it's not my area of expertise, but there certainly are people who think that these very high rates of distress in young adults are related to social media use. And there are some studies pointing in that direction. But I haven't done anything on it. I can only say I've read some of those studies, and people are arguing that might contribute. We're seeing this increase. I was telling young people in the room, these are the worst times in your life. They are. And it's getting worse over historical time. So we're seeing an increase across birth cohorts. So young people have long been more distressed than older people, but they're getting more distressed over time and over historical time.
So now I am in a difficult situation because this is a super interesting discussion and there are more questions out there, but there's also a reception waiting for us behind the slides, and our time horizon is getting shorter.
Yeah.
So I suggest we comply with socio-emotional selectivity theory and shift our preferences towards the reception and continue the discussion over drinks and over snacks. But before we do so, please join me in thanking one more time Professor Carstensen for this brilliant lecture.